manipulating value, and by value we mean basically light and dark, is a great way to create dramatic effect in our drawings. But there's a few techniques, a few thoughts, a few strategies that we can use when we apply value, when we apply tone in various lightnesses and darknesses, that can really bring out not just clarity of what's what in our drawing, but really add a sense of drama. And the other side is that if we're not careful, we can end up with a lot of value that's fairly in the middle. And this tends to have a habit of making our drawing look a bit flat and a bit hard to work out the detail, because it ends up blurring the lines and bringing everything to the same level. So before we can apply value, though, we need to have something to apply it to. So I'm doing a quick drawing of the Catholic Church in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, just on the outskirts of Paris. A really grand structure that sits just opposite the former royal palace of Louis XIV, a palace he used before Versailles was built. I'm drawing this with a 0.2 millimeter multiliner, and it's a nice simple building, and I thought it was a good example to demonstrate applying value, because in lots of ways it's a bit challenging. There's a lot of value on it. There's actually only a few relatively small areas that have strong light on them, or direct light on them at all. There's some bouncing light on the front columns, and there are some parts that are in deeper shade and shadow than others. But there is a lot of reasonably dark value, and the challenge will be to apply it and to show it, and yet not to lose the form of the colonnade and the building behind it and the other various elements in a lot of dark tone, in a relatively dark value over the whole drawing. And on the other hand, if we apply it with a little subtlety, then we can actually manipulate the values we have in reality to heighten the shape that we're looking at. So I'm using my Copic sketch markers, the neutral grey colour, and I start with an N3, which I've decided is going to be the colour, the value I use for a lot of the front. However, do you know that feeling when you start using a marker and it starts to get a bit dry? So then you swap and get another one, and it's not really much better, and you start to get this patchy effect. Well, this is the feeling I'm having right now. I haven't used the markers much lately, and I don't know whether they've dried a little or whether it's just that they were like this last time and I haven't remembered. So at this point, I go for a darker. No, I didn't go for a dark. That's where I stopped the camera and refilled my N3s and N4s. I'm actually not using a wide range of markers in this. I'm using N3 and N4 and N5 for most of it, and just a little bit of N2 and a little bit of N6. The N6 is really just some dark highlights around the doorways. So with a fairly limited range of value of darkness for most of this, it's important that we apply the values so that we don't lose the ability to see what's what. We want to still reinforce the form in what we do. Now, the columns are quite visible, but that's partly because of the colour. They are a different stone. So in terms of the value, that won't be so clear. Now I'm using the N3 at this point, and coming down. I think I even used the N2 actually for that. Basically what we want to do is we don't want to have two values that are pretty much the same up against each other on different objects, because then it will be hard to work out what's what. Now I've got my N4 here and I'm coming up over the top of the N3, just trying to reflect the fact that the shade is stronger, is darker further down towards the ground, that there's less light bouncing around off the surrounding buildings and the path in front that's hitting down below, that more of that reflected light hits the upper parts of this front wall and therefore make it just a little bit lighter. So at this point I'm using the 4 and the 3. I haven't yet used the 5. And I'm quite happy to let the columns stay quite contrast at this point, to let them stay light. And when I have to do, now I'm using the 4 on the darkest parts of the column, which is where the shade is hitting them. Now, shade is darker than shadow. So where there's a shadow being cast from the side of the building, from that left side of the building, that gives a darker effect than what's on the rest of the columns, which is simply shade, which is simply where the sun can't reach. And so at this point, I'm trying to establish the main areas of lighter and darker areas, and all the time be careful not getting too close together. Now you'll notice that central door and that column are both N4, and so they've merged into one large blob. Now that's what I mean when I say this is what we want to avoid. We want to avoid having the same value coming up against itself in two different objects. However, I do intend to put an N5 in that doorway, so I'm not worried about that at this point because I know that's going to become darker. And then we also need to treat our columns a bit differently when they're silhouetted against the sky and when they've got a wall behind them. See, now I come in with the N5 and see what a difference that makes now with that column. And suddenly the dark on the column, the N4, doesn't look nearly as dark as it looked before, because now we have a darker value. And one of the things about value is that we can't really read it. We can't really get a sense of how light or dark a lot of these tones are until we finish, because we're judging whether something's lighter or darker than the other values around it. And if we haven't added those other values yet, we really don't know. And so when we're doing something like this, we do want to get the darkest values we're going to put onto our drawing as reasonably early as we can, because then we have a sense of what's happening. So that's just a bit more 4 that I've put on. These Copic markers do dry very quickly, but they do dry just a little bit lighter. You can see that column is now looking lighter than it was. Now I'm using the N5 at the moment on the figures to help them to stand out more. But as I generally darken the area behind them, I end up deciding to switch the figures to an N6 after I use it in just a couple of places. So all the time it's a case of looking at what we've done, looking at the form that we're trying to show that we want to come forward, and working out what can I make darker. Now you'll notice with these columns I'm leaving them lighter on each edge in most cases, left and right vertical edges. And that's because that's reflecting the fact that there's light bouncing around that actually does lighten what we're seeing as the edges, and that The darker part, the darker shade, is at the back, in other words, facing us. And so we want to show that. And that also gives us this wonderful sliver of lighter area down the side of the columns, which is really handy for helping it to be distinct from the value behind the value, the darkness, the amount of darkness behind. Now, the other thing that's really helpful in a scene such as this is to make sure that we keep the whites absolutely white. And as I said, there aren't many white areas here, but those two white areas on the two closest columns are really important to keep white and not to mess up the edge so that we end up having to adjust it and make it smaller and smaller. Now, what I need to do is I'm wanting to decrease the difference between the value of the columns and the wall behind, but I want to do it reasonably slowly and carefully so that we don't end up losing the sense of the columns, that they don't become too close to the wall behind. And we can do that by firstly not making them too dark, but we can also do it by making the wall behind darker. Now, with the Copic markers, generally they're the colour, they're the value, not the colour, but they're the value, the light and the dark, that the number represents. But by doing several layers in the one place, we can get a slightly darker version of that value, which can be very helpful when we're manipulating things with a reasonable degree of finesse. And so now, this is the period where we need to look back and think, okay, how's it looking? And occasionally I would also look through the camera because it does look a little bit different in real life. Now I've got the 6, and just in a couple of places with the 6, I add some lines. I also, at this point, in a moment, because of that door, come back with my pen, with my 0.2 millimeter Copic fine liner, and I add the decoration that's, well, not so much decoration, but some line work to indicate the structure of the door. One of the things I do closer to the end is I use the fine liner again to create a stronger sense of distinction between some of the architectural elements. And I think that worked quite well. So I now just put the 6 on the figures, and now I'm using, I think it's still a 4, but just going darker over the central area. Now trying to smooth over the transition from darker down the base to lighter up the top. And it's about this time too that I'm also just using an N2 at times to just take away any bits of white that I don't want to be there. I don't want there to be any white except actually where there is sunlight, not just because I didn't get quite close enough. So now I'm using my fine liner to just darken some of the lines to create a stronger sense of what's happening. And so we're getting pretty close to the end of this. Of course, you'll find this photo on my channel community page. So as well as the photo, you'll find a line version of this, that if you want to have a go just applying the tone straight away, playing with the values and not having to draw the actual structure, then it's your lucky day, because you'll be able to just screenshot and print off a copy of the church and then start with the tone, start with the value. So now I'm just looking at it and working out, are there some fine tunes to do, darkening some of the figures again. But I'm looking at this and thinking that all the elements stand out quite well, and they do indicate the lovely backlit nature of this view with just a few highlights of direct sunlight. And this is where we don't want to be too timid, but we still want to protect any light areas. This is where we really don't want to too quickly darken light areas because we can't get those back. We can darken dark areas even further, of course. That's not a problem. And then I think this is pretty much it at this stage. Yep, I think that's the case. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Well, what do you think of this exercise in manipulating value, the darkness and the lightness, to not just make our object clearer to see, but to create a somewhat dramatic effect? It's a great skill to develop, just to learn that balance between going dark and not too dark, and not finish up with a lot of mid-tones creating a muddy effect. Why don't you give it a go and have a lot of fun? But whatever you do and however you do it, make sure you do have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.